Hello, I'm Brent Jensen, and this is a presentation of The Onliest Monk, Remembering Thelonious. This is part 2. It's sponsored by the Manieri Jazz and Swing Foundation at the Anacortes Public Library. That was Monkstone Theocracy, a group led by drummer Greg Williamson, featuring Chris Seimer on bass, Bill Anschel on piano, and myself on saxophone. We were doing Baya, one of my favorite Thelonious Monk tunes. On this segment, I'll just talk about, again, on each one of these, I'm just seeing it as an opportunity to give you some resources to check out, because, of course, if you just, in our day and age now, just Google Thelonious Monk, you get all sorts of stuff, almost maybe too much stuff. But I had mentioned in part 1, the biography and the documentary. There's a couple documentaries and 3 or 4 books, at least, written on Monk. The reason that I'm playing soprano most of the time, I'm playing the curved soprano, so I get a lot of questions about this one. You know, usually you see the straight soprano, not the curved soprano, is because I kind of associate this music with that sound. Monk usually used a tenor saxophonist in his quartet, but there is one of the most famous jazz soprano saxophone players, Steve Lacy, went through a period of time where he had a band with the trombone player Roswell Rudd, and they only played the music of Thelonious Monk. They played just his music only, and nobody else except Monk was really playing Monk's music. Monk made it a point to kind of try to get his music out there. He played a few standards and music by other people, but in general, he was playing his own original compositions. And Steve found that these fit on the soprano sax really well, and they do. It's a great range. Almost every one of Monk's tunes fits perfectly onto the soprano saxophone range, or up in the upper range of the tenor saxophone. I guess that's why I usually had tenor saxophone players playing with them: John Coltrane, Charlie Rouse for most of the recordings that you find with Thelonious Monk, and then also Johnny Griffin, so all tenor saxophone players. But there's during this period of time when Steve Lacy had formed his Monk kind of tribute band, more or less, there was an album in 1959 that he put out called Reflections. Steve Lacy plays Thelonious Monk, and he's just doing the music of Thelonious Monk. Baya, the tune we just performed for you, is actually featured on that particular recording. And Monk's music in more recent years, I guess, I'm not sure when this fake book came out. For a while, circulating, there was a fake book of his music. Those are just lead sheets that have his melodies and his chord progressions that somebody had painstakingly written out by hand that was kind of circulating throughout the musical community. But Don Sickler, great trumpet player and kind of a jazzologist, jazz musicologist. He has Second Floor Music, publishes a lot of Monk's music. He put together a couple fake books that are published by Hal Leonard, and they're just called the Thelonious Monk Fake Book. They're available for all the different instruments: C instruments, B flat for tenor sax and soprano and trumpet, E flat, bass clef. And Monk had written, I think there's about 65 tunes. That's probably close to his entire collection of tunes, which to most people would think, that's not a lot of songs. Compared to most of the bebop musicians, that's being pretty prolific. Compared to Duke Ellington, not so much. Ellington was writing a lot of music, and a lot of music didn't even get published during his lifetime. And he was constantly writing every day, and for large ensembles, for small ensembles. Monk was always writing these tunes with a small group in mind. And there was a big band recording that he did live at Town Hall. But most of his stuff is in the quartet format. It's him on piano, a bassist, a drummer, and most often a tenor saxophone player. But his music in that particular fake book has been edited very well. So there's all sorts of little references if you're a musician. It's a really great resource for Monk's music because it has the correct chord changes. It has a whole glossary that explains Monk's way of thinking of harmony, because he had a different way of kind of putting the chords together. They talk about that a little bit in Kelly's biography of him. They get not into great detail, but they talk a little bit about how his harmony was different than a lot of the other bebop musicians. In fact, it worked to his disadvantage sometimes because they wanted a lot of the musicians wanted a more normal, a regular pianist that was not going to be playing these kind of strange dissonant things in back of them. And his way of comping or playing behind soloists, he felt like he wanted to interact more with them instead of just backing them up. So that was kind of a difference in a way of approaching it that Monk took. In fact, talking about the way music's put together, the bebop musicians, I mentioned it a little bit in part one because I demonstrated anthropology and rhythming, which are based on the chord changes of I Got Rhythm by the Gershwin brothers, George and Ira. And this technique is called, they're really just called lines if you're a musician talking to another musician. But I've been in the academic world, and so usually when I'm doing a lecture, I'll say they're a contrafact. So a contrafact is a different melody that will work over the chord progressions of an existing song, because like I mentioned before in part one, chord progressions you don't have to copyright them. You can play on in fact, I've found ways around that before when I had to play in establishments where they needed to have a license, the mechanical license. They say, are you doing original music? We say, no, we're playing jazz standards. Oh, we can't hire you because we don't pay the licensing fees to ASCAP and BMI or whatever. So we said, no problem, we'll just come in, we'll just solo. We'll solo over these tunes. We'll just call out the tune, but we won't play the tune. We'll just improvise over it. And that's what the bebop musicians were doing, just playing solos over the chord progressions or writing their own new melodies, which were very complex in most cases, over those melodies. And Monk did this a little bit, as much as the other players did. Not quite so much as Charlie Parker. A large portion of Charlie Parker's repertoire is based on chord progressions from the Great American Songbook, tunes by Jerome Kern, Cole Porter, Rodgers Hammerstein, whatever, the Broadway show tune writers. And so one of the ones that Monk did, I'll do a demonstration of a tune that he wrote for his very good friend, as we mentioned before. They were really almost like brothers. Bud Powell he kind of treated like a little brother. He was younger than Monk. And he wrote a tune called In Walked Bud, dedicated to Bud Powell. And it's based on the tune Blue Skies. So Blue Skies, I'm not even sure who the original, I should know who the composer of Blue Skies is, but maybe Harold Arlen, maybe. I'm thinking Over the Rainbow. But so that's the first 8 measures to Blue Skies. That would be the melody. And you can hear a little bit of it in Monk's contrafact because he still uses kind of the same guide notes. So he actually starts with the Blue Skies, but quickly departs from it. So that's one of the places where he's borrowing from another tune. He did it on a couple other ones. There's a tune called Hackensack, which is based on Lady Be Good by George Gershwin. There's a few other ones, but he largely, a lot of his pieces, the one we started off on, opened up part one with Well You Needn't, that's an original composition. Baya, that we opened this part two with, also an original composition. We'll be closing with a version that's also an original ballad of his. So I would say to the large extent, most of Monk's music, he's still using blues, and he will use rhythm changes, like I mentioned in part 1. He used I Got Rhythm and did rhythming. But most of the tunes were kind of from scratch and quite unique too. Kind of all sorts of different sorts of forms, sometimes very short. He had some tunes that were 4 measures long. That was it. A standard jazz tune is usually 32 measures long, but he had a few that were like 4 measures, 8 measures, and just repeated them over and over again. And again, they would have that quality of sticking with you. So I hear from a lot of people, they'll say, Monk's music, it's just kind of strange, angular, and there's a lot of his music that's very, I think, very tuneful. It can kind of stick with you. Da 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 da. The one that I just played, da da. It has this little kind of descends all the way through there, and then he repeats it back. You won't get as much repetition from Bud Powell, from Dizzy Gillespie, from Charlie Parker, from the other bebop players. It's as if their melodies they're already improvising for you. They're kind of doing it in unison usually. The horn players are playing them together, but they're hitting you with this barrage of notes right from the gate. The gate opens and boom, there they are. But Monk will play with using some space. He'll come back to it. In fact, if his tenor players just played a long solo and it goes to Monk to play a solo, he'll repeat the melody. It's almost as if he's saying, you may have forgotten what our subject was after that long tenor solo, so here I'm going to play some dung ding, dung dung ding. He would state it again or just slightly vary it a little bit. So the theme and variations became a very important thing for Monk's playing. It's a very lyrical kind of music. Some of his tunes have actually had lyrics set to them. There's an album that was done back in 1990 by Carmen McRae, great jazz vocalist. It's a really good album, worth searching out. Carmen Sings Monk. And so in fact, she does that tune that I just played for you, In Walked Bud. And it talks about Bud Powell and some of the lyrics typically that they'll come up with are sometimes autobiographical, so they will talk about some of the bebop players, some of the places they played, and so you get kind of a little story behind it as well. There's a few tunes of his. I think Around Midnight might have a couple different variations of lyrics as well. So there's several of them. Usually Monk himself did not set any of his music, to lyrics. Early on, he was trying to have, some hits and get some tunes published, and he did have people write lyrics and put lyrics to his tunes, and they go into that in the biography. There was a couple times when his tune was released under one title, then he kind of repurposed it and released it a little bit later. But the Carmen Sings Monk album that came out in 1990, really good one, and a different approach to Monk, where you're hearing a vocalist, sing with the rhythm section. One other important aspect of Thelonious Monk's life was his involvement with Pannica. Pannica, let's see, she was a member of the Rothschilds family, de Koenigswarter, and you can find there's some information on her. There's actually there's a documentary that was done on Pannica that you can find on YouTube, I believe. But the book is called Nika's Dream. There's actually a song written by Horace Silver called Nika's Dream. Nika's Dream, the life and legend of the jazz baroness. She ended up being this kind of patron to a lot of the different jazz musicians. She had a very nice apartment in New York where that became kind of a crash pad for a lot of the different jazz musicians. Charlie Parker infamously passed away, in her apartment. But Pannica and Thelonious Monk particularly had a very interesting relationship, in the book and the documentary both kind of examine that. She was the youngest child of Charles Rothschild, so she's part of the Rothschild family, so, an heiress and lots of money. And she used that money to kind of be a patron saint to the jazz musicians at the time, create a safe place for them to kind of hang out, to socialize, and there's in fact in part 3 I'll talk about a more recent graphic novel that came out that's talking about Pannica and Thelonious Monk's relationship. So we're going to close this part with, so I thought I would mention Pannica, because the piece that Bill Anchel is going to play a solo version for you on piano is entitled Pannica, which Monk had written, dedicated to Nika, sometimes she was known as. And also, before I turn it over to Bill, since Bill's going to be playing solo, there's a lot of Monk solo albums as well, and probably one of the better known ones was from 1965 called Solo Monk. On the album cover here you can see, they've got him as the pilot of an airplane here, so some graphic designer for Columbia Records, got creative with the album cover. But there's a bunch of solo versions of standard tunes. He tended to play other standards, other people's music, a little bit more as a soloist than he did within his group. I think he felt within his group he wanted to push his music all the time. So you're going to hear a solo piano version of Pannica by Bill Anshel.